Okay. Hi, I can see we have a full house today, actually. So I know people are still logging in, but I already just want to take the opportunity to welcome everybody to this webinar today on M4M. And I know Erik will take us through in a little while just what we'll be talking about today. And many of you met Erik already last week, and you met his colleagues already on Thursday in the FTP workshop that we had. But just before, as we kick off here, just to welcome you, my name is Faye. I'm the Managing Director from RavoWorks Africa. And we're really happy to collaborate with VODAN Africa and also GoFair on supporting you on the back end with some of the webinar things. And as we start, I wanted to just welcome people in the audience because we have really quite a diverse range of people with us here today. So in terms of demographics, lots of different countries, including Ethiopia, Kenya, Indonesia, so quite diverse audience, but also diverse in terms of the kind of backgrounds. So a number of you were able to register for this webinar in advance, and that really helps us always to see who is about to join us, which organizations do they work for, but also what is their background. And that helps also Erik to prepare the content and the examples. So here we can see for this webinar, we had over 34 different registrations. And the backgrounds, from students to also data scientists. We have a few of you who are medical doctors, and data stewards, economists, etc. So I'm just having a look who's chatting me. Julius, okay, good. So welcome, and I know that makes it a little bit challenging as well to make sure we've always got good examples that can kind of cover this entire cohort of people, but we'll try our best to make sure that your information needs are taken care of. And just before we start, I wanted to share with you kind of house rules. I think by now, with the situation that we're so used to having so many different online webinars all the time, most of us are aware of this, but please do mute your microphones and make sure that on your screen your microphone is on mute so that we don't get interference from your background noise. I think many of you have been in conferences where you've got kids screaming in the back, pots banging, doors opening, helicopters flying over, all of these things. So make sure you're muted. And if you have any questions as Erik is presenting, please do put them into the chat function in this Zoom platform. And we'll try and get to as many of those questions as we can. I also want to thank many of you for sharing some of the questions in advance in the registration link. So as we progress in some of our other webinars going forward, there will always be the option in the pre-registration for you to ask some questions in advance. And once again, that really helps the presenters to make sure that they can build in those questions into their presentation. So I know that a fair or dealing with fair data might still be quite new for many of us, and others, we might be very well familiar with it. So I want to just for us to just do a quick poll or just a quick temperature in the room and see, how do you feel about FAIR so far? So on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with the FAIR principles to date? And you should see the poll has come up on your screen. I can see the votes are coming in. Okay, very good. So 1 is I have no idea what they are. It's the first time I'm hearing about it. 2 is, I have a slight idea. 3 is I know a bit, but I would like to have a quick summary, actually. 4 is, listen, I'm pretty well versed. And 5 is I consider myself an expert. Basically, I pretty much invented FAIR, right? So let's have a look. I have about half of the responses in. Half of the responses are in. 85% now of the responses are in. And so I'll just give it another 7 seconds, and then we'll close the poll so that we have an idea of how comfortable we are here, and also for Erik to have an idea, where we might need to give a few more examples. Okay. Let's check. All right. Ivy, I think we can close the poll. Thank you very much. We can close the poll and have a look. Okay. So what we can see here is that actually the majority, it's kind of it's a split. It's almost an even split, right? So we've got 25%, 29% of you that say, listen, I have a slight idea, and 29% saying I'm pretty well versed. So that, Erik, that gives you quite a range, right, to work with. But one of the things that we discussed last week when we were preparing for this, we said, well, let's just, give a bit of a basic example around FAIR, because we anticipated that the ranges might be very different. Not everybody might be fully familiar. So we'll just share with you a brief example so that we can then kickstart off and we're all at the same level. So thank you very much for that. And when we discussed about FAIR last week with Erik, and Erik, you'll jump in here as well if at any point. But what we try to look at is more FAIR from like looking at it from preparing a meal, right? If you were going to prepare a meal using FAIR, what does that mean in terms of concept behind it, right? So what do these different pieces of the F, the A, the I, and the R kind of mean? So when we're talking about the F, when we're talking about the F, it's really looking about more, findable, meaning more, can I find information about the meal? I want to prepare a certain meal for my family and friends. Can I find the information for this meal? Does there exist somewhere a big library where that information is available? And when we then move to the A, what we're looking at is then, well, accessible, great, I can find it, the information does exist, but is it also accessible to me? I want to make the meal, I know the information is there, but can I access it? Or do I need a certain, access code or membership information to get access to this particular meal information? Erik, do you want to go ahead already and add something?
No, Faye, this is, I think, all the basic elements here. So I think this is good, just the way you got it.
Okay, good. I saw you are muted. So, and let's say now then, I found the information. I've realized that I can also access it. I don't need a membership code in order to, access this recipe for the meal. But then the I in FAIR is really looking at more, well, can I even read the recipe? I have it, yes, but can I read it? Is it written in a language that I understand, right? And thinking about that even from a machine perspective, the question is whatever data, is it written in a language that the machine can easily absorb it, right? And finally, the R, when we're looking at that, is really then, when I have the recipe, is can I share it? Do I need certain licenses for it? If I wanted to have more context around how the meal has been prepared, has it been prepared for a group of 5 people or for 10 people? What happens if I change the ingredients? Can I get some of that information as well? So just in a basic sense, when we're looking at FAIR from a machine perspective, I think it can help us if we take it, as the very, very basic, of course, example of preparing a meal, and you want to have the information on the recipe from the beginning all the way to the end, including being able to change some of your ingredients. So Erik, from there, I'm going to stop my screen share, and then we'll move ahead and you walk us through the rest of the training.
Hey, thanks a lot, Faye. And hello, everybody. Welcome back. And I will now look for my own screen to share. And that's going to be here. Let's see if that works. Yeah, so you should be seeing my screen. And just as a reminder to everyone, I will be showing my slides from this view on my slide preparer, because sometimes there's a little bit of a glitch between Keynote and Zoom. So I'm going to show it, and it gives me a little more control anyways over the slides. And so yeah, this is the second installment of what could be something like 8 metadata for machine webinars. I consider this all one workshop because we are working together to build metadata for the FAIR data points that will be installed in numerous African countries here. So I first wanted just to mention, here's another survey that we created just a few hours ago. And this is also then to help us figure out a little bit more in detail if there are skill sets among the, 26 of you who are on this call right now, 29 of you who are on this call. We would like to know if any of you have skill sets for data modeling or semantic web or for coding RDF or XML. And you can see the exact questions at this questionnaire, and the link will be mailed to you or will be given to you after this webinar. So don't worry about writing down the link right now. You'll have a chance to interact with this questionnaire later. But it would be great to get feedback, because what we will be looking for going forward is potential technical people who could then help locally with the building of the proper metadata that we need to make real fair metadata for a fair data point. So answering this questionnaire will be a big help to us. It should only take a couple minutes of your time. I think it's a short questionnaire. And then I want to maybe just spend a moment here giving us just a few slides again to kind of give us context and overview on this whole process. So we are, in fact, in the VODAN Africa Metadata for Machine workshop, and we plan on having this webinar for 8 weeks in a row. And this is the second one now. So we did Metadata for Machine workshop number 1 on April 28th last week. And now here we are on May 5th. And you can see that I'm numbering these workshops as 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, etc. And why this numbering? Because we have already, in a very prototype form, we've already run Metadata for Machine workshop number 2 and Metadata for Machine workshop number 3. And by the way, the products of those workshops, the metadata components that we built in those workshops, are in fact freely available. And they would be something that you could even check out for yourselves. For example, here's the metadata that was created in Metadata for Machine workshop number 2. And I covered this a little bit last week, and I'm always happy to tell you more about it. But just in case you want to see, the metadata that we create in this workshop, although it will be very much to serve the purpose of launching the FAIR data points locally, that metadata could very well be of use to others, and we would like to make it as reusable as possible. And then if we look forward a little bit here, what we see is that the first 4 metadata for machine workshops here are really just kind of getting us orientated and grounded in this idea of metadata, fair metadata, machine actionable metadata. And then the last of the workshops will be much more sort of articulating the decisions that we made and the metadata that we want to have to be able to figure out a way to actually make that machine actionable and try to fit it in somehow to the fair data point. I also mentioned, that in these workshops, we are very much building the airplane while we are flying it, and that I really consider this a co-development project. This is certainly something that is not yet a complete package, and we are very much interested in the contributions of all of you in actually advancing and establishing this process of metadata for machine workshops. I mentioned last week we had our first metadata for machine workshop. That was, for me, considered very introductory. Today, we're actually going to start a process where we talk about metadata needs. And so what is it we really want to accomplish with this metadata? What's behind it? What's motivating us? So we're going to enter into a metadata for humans mode for now, before we get to the metadata for machines. There will be some homework assignments this week. where you will be asked to think of some solutions for metadata, but only in a very general, broad context. Then on next week, next Tuesday, we're going to compare your answers and try and begin to draw a consensus on the metadata that we would like to have for the FAIR data points. And we're going to call that convergence. And we're going to say within this VODAN community, we're eventually going to get to the point where we decide on basic metadata elements that we want to have as part of our VODAN data and metadata. And if we can do all that in the next week and a half or 2 weeks, then we're well placed to begin thinking about, okay, how do we begin making this into machine actionable formats? And eventually where we want to get to by the very end of this process is that the VODAN community will have declared its commitment to certain metadata elements. You know, these will be metadata for the VODAN users. So anybody else who wants to join VODAN should then subscribe to these metadata. And we'll figure out a way to register that and make it available for reuse to others. We're going to solve some problems here, and it's no use if we solve it that someone else has to reinvent that wheel independently. So we'll try to use convergence to accelerate FAIR data and services. So that's kind of the overview. And then for today, what I have is a series of slides, and I'll just do a quick review from last week, just to remind us where we left off. And then we will go through in some detail on these 9 metadata components. And I will help to try and frame this in such a way that we can think about it as, without having to worry about the machine readability yet, or how we encode this, or the mechanisms by which we express the metadata. It's enough for us just to decide what it is we want to have on our FAIR data point and what authorities we have to consult in order to get that metadata. And that involves some consideration on stakeholders, among others considerations. And then lastly, I'll get to the homework, which is an exercise where we begin to scope these 9 metadata components. And there's a couple questions left over from last week, and I'll try and get to those too. Okay, so here's the review, just a few slides on the review. You may remember this slide from last week. It's just a schematic overview of a FAIR data point. And we have a bunch of data located who knows where. It's in different repositories. So very distributed data. But we have the FAIR data point, which is linking machine actionable metadata to those data. So by visiting the FAIR data point, you can get an overview of the data in this distributed architecture. And when you look at it from the point of view of then VODAN Africa, what we see is that the data is the electronic case report forms, for which we have built already a semantic data model, so a machine readable form of that electronic CRF. And we will enter in, and this is another problem we'll come back to, but we will have to begin thinking about the verification process in the local hospital or clinic, where patient data will be imported into these electronic case report forms so that they can then be made available to the FAIR data point. And I've mentioned this before, but we already have worked with questionnaires that help us to begin framing what that verification process could look like. And then also from last week, when Luis and Case showed you the actual FAIR data point in action, you saw this view of the web client for the FAIR data point. And this is my own personal FAIR data point. It's just for demonstration purposes, but here is the FAIR data point. You see a number of catalogs. Within those catalogs are data sets, and within those data sets are, in fact, the actual distribution of the data. And so you can get to the data easily enough, but the FAIR data point, as it exists right now as a, as a web server application that you might boot up and start running, it has already some basic generic metadata components in there. And this is really high level, super generic. It doesn't tell you anything about the content other than just the fact that it kind of exists and there's a license, some basic things. We will try, so I guess a way to say this is that going forward, once these fair data points are installed, what we want to do is to begin customizing that fair data point to reflect the governance and the regulations, the ownership, the responsibilities, but then also more of the content that we would like to tell in our data sets. So the Metadata for Machine Workshop is really an opportunity to kind of customize the fair data point for your particular location. And the first thing we will do is we will edit these fair data point metadata to include links to a VODAN metadata schema that basically just announces to the world that there is a case report form for COVID-19 and it's located somewhere. So it's a very generic metadata in itself, but still it's now pointing to some content issues. And this metadata schema will be something that we can show probably as early as next week, but it will be one of the key components, I think likely to be actually installed in the Fair Data Point in a Box application. So this is something that's still in the works, but should be pretty straightforward to implement. And that will be something that we can discuss as part of the Metadata for Machine Workshop. But then also going forward, we want to add components, metadata components, that really reflect the basic needs of the community here. And what I will talk about in the remaining slides will be components that we will eventually edit into the Fair Data Point. We're still not sure yet exactly how that will look, if it's really modular and we're inserting links everywhere, or if we're gonna, in the end, maybe for simplicity, we create one metadata file that contains all the components that we're interested in. So we'll still have to figure out what that looks like, but it doesn't stop us from taking the first steps right now, which is, again, going back to last week, I had ended by asking you to consider these basic 9 metadata elements that we can see mapped onto the FAIR principles, and in relation to how we were thinking about compliance to these FAIR principles in these FAIR metrics. And if you're more of a technical person, I think that exercise might have been actually pretty interesting and thought-provoking, and probably would give you a lot deeper insight into what the FAIR principles are really asking for. I would be interested to know your reaction to that. On the other hand, for those of you who are not really technical, this metrics document might have been incomprehensible. And that's okay, because it's a pretty technical document. And if you don't have the computer science background, it might not make a lot of sense. But in any case, I hope that by engaging these two points of view, that you begin to get a feeling for what it is we would like to have in order for the machine to be able to do FAINR on its own. So that's the ultimate goal. So what I will do going forward now in the next slides is I'm going to go through each of these points and try to flesh out in more detail what's being asked for and how you might approach coming up with an answer for it. And at the same time, though, what I would like to do is reference you to a special issue of this journal called Data Intelligence. And this was an entire special issue. It came out only a few months ago, just last year. And it was devoted to the first generation implementation choices for FAIR principles. And so it's a really great resource if you just want to figure out how it is that we, what are our options when we want to implement the FAIR principles. So this is a very nice article here. It just covers a very high level view of the FAIR principles. How do you interpret them and what their implementation considerations are. But I will reference back to that special issue in the next few slides. Okay, so here's the metadata for machine components, all 9 of them, and just some considerations around them. And so, and yeah, by the way, I'm not going to go through numerical order. I've kind of rearranged these slides here so that they reflect a kind of priority that you might want to follow yourself, because yeah, it's maybe worth saying. FAIR is not necessarily a binary phenomenon. There can be degrees of fairness to any digital resource. And you can see a large number of things that we can do here just to create good metadata. If you don't have the time or the skill or the resources to implement at all of these positions, that's okay. What I think is very nice about the FAIR principles is that they give you a kind of an intrinsic roadmap on how to make your resources increasingly readable and actionable for the machine. And it's perfectly okay to say, well, at this point in time, we don't have a lot of resources, so I can only do a few simple things, and maybe I have to let the more complicated, difficult things go for later, and that's perfectly fine. It might even be that you can formulate research projects down the road, and these things become a whole research project. So what I'm doing here then is giving a kind of a priority list as well. What I think might be the most important, relevant metadata to do first, and at the very end are kind of the leftovers that maybe are more technical, and we can come back to that if there's time and energy in the project. Okay, so I'm looking at number 2 here, which is referring to an element in principle F2 that says data are described with rich metadata. And by rich metadata here, what F2 is asking for is metadata that would allow your data to be easily found by someone who's looking for that kind of data. And the word rich here is trying to signify that, the more metadata you can put in here, the better the chances that someone can find it. And so the richer, the better. And then it's sort of left, because it's colored blue here, I would say it's left to the community, to the domain community, to answer for itself what it means by rich findability metadata. So what I'm saying here in this comment at the bottom, what is the minimal acceptable metadata needed to ensure findability? All right, so this is going to be now a question to those of you who will be setting up the FAIR data point and managing the content on it. These are electronic case report forms for COVID-19 patients. So what other metadata elements would be required to ensure findability? Certainly there might be something like having individuals or organizations in there, geographical locations, date and time stamps. You might include funding sources so people understand who's funding these things. There may be issues of publishers. Maybe there are other repositories that are storing the data. So we can begin to think about the basic findability metadata. What do you think should go in here? There's a nice article from the special issue called Making Data and Workflows Findable for Machines. So I don't want to use up all your time reading research articles, but if you need a reference, there's a good place to start. And I can also point out that there are many schema already created out there that do exactly F2. They're highly generic and highly reusable, and you might find some of these things at an organization called DataCite or Crossref, among many others. So I'm starting with number 2 because it's so basic. It's, you know, if people can't find your data, then it's a big problem. And so this problem has actually been solved many times over. And then it's sort of up to us to figure out what we will define for F2. And, you know, we can talk about strategies for formulating that. I'm going to jump now to the R principles, because these are also kind of the classic metadata type metadata that we have in mind. And here we're looking at R 1.1, and it's metadata and data are released with clear and accessible data usage license. So the importance of a license cannot be overstated. Even if your resources are completely open and completely free, they might often, well, they would, in the business world anyways, they would not be used unless they were also accompanied by a license saying that they were open and free. Because if there is no license, then the legal reuse is ambiguous. And there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of stakeholders out there who will not risk using data if they cannot be sure that there is a license behind it and they know how to properly use that data. So, and the real example here comes from an experience I had in a project called Open Facts. It was a public-private partnership with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, and was trying to make pre-competitive pharmacology data fair or reusable. And there was a lot of very nice data sets out there created in an academic environment that there had no associated license to it. You know, the researchers typically don't think about licensing. And the lawyers at the pharmaceutical companies, even though the data were very nice to use, they wouldn't touch them because that data could bring all kinds of different liabilities for the pharmaceutical company if something goes wrong. So it's really essential to have a license. And the question we can ask ourselves is, well, what licenses should we employ on the VODAN fair data point? We can use template licenses that are already out there, or we can create our own. If we have lawyers in the group or we have contacts with legal counsel, we might even conceive of making our own usage licenses custom to this project. But if the metadata is to be freely open and available, then there may be already licenses we can borrow for that. Ideally, the licenses we link to themselves could be machine actionable in some sense. There are very nice licenses that are already linked to in the fair data point. You may consider reusing these. And then also, I know many of you are familiar with the open science framework, and I'm just taking a screenshot here of the licenses available in the open science framework. So those might be reasonable to consider as well. And again, then there's another very nice article in the special issue called Licensing Fair Data for Reuse. And I think it's a little bit focused on the European point of view, but I think it still covers very well the basic issues of copyright and kind of digital licensing. Okay, number 8, component number 8, is data and metadata are associated with detailed provenance. So provenance here, in a real computer science context, is really about all the information that led to the creation of this object, such that its reuse can be done with confidence and with trust. So do I know where this data came from? Can I believe in it? Why would I believe in it? What's the evidence behind it? And a lot of times, at least in scientific context, the belief comes from the experimental protocols that generated it. You know, that we set up this kind of an experiment, we ran these kinds of assays, we collected these data, we performed these analyses on the data and statistics, and we conclude this. So just kind of documenting in a useful way where this data was generated and how it was. So where does this data come from? Why do I trust it? In our case, you know, these electronic case report forms are coming from the verification in the clinical setting in the hospitals of patient data. So to the degree that we begin to work out what that verification process is going to look like in the hospitals, that may give us some of the information that we want to record and document in our provenance metadata here. I'm also linking to an organization called protocols.io, just to give you some feeling for what standardized protocol provenance type metadata might look like. And the last point I'm making here is that the R1.2 provenance metadata typically are highly idiosyncratic to the particular use case. And so it's, you know, everyone does a kind of an experiment or collects some data. In the details of those are to be recorded here. So in general, you know, even though R1.2 is really important, you know, we could probably spend months talking about and working out the provenance metadata here. We won't do that. We will find, you know, timely and practical solutions for our needs right now. But just to say, this is a real technical issue that can take a lot of our time. I'm looking at number 9 right now, and I don't want to say too much about this yet. This will become clear more towards the end of the metadata for machine workshop, or even as the fair data points are really up and running. But already you can see that there's a notion that we have to begin to define on this fair data point who the domain relevant communities are, because those communities are going to be choosing the standards by which to report this data and metadata. And indeed, it's all kind of recursive here. The metadata that we select to show in this metadata for machines workshop is going to be a part of R1.3. It's a part of the standards of the VODAN community. And, you know, so there will be a moment where we begin to think about domain relevant communities. Who are the stakeholders here? And I'm listing just some ideas. There's country, there's the information technology organizations that are running the fair data point. So maybe universities or the organizations just, you know, serving the data. There will be the clinical organizations, the hospitals. There's people. So there will, many of you will I think, begin to call yourselves data stewards in this context. But there are also the doctors at the hospital, the patients. There's the VODAN project itself. These are all stakeholders who may have something to say about these standards and who may eventually need to sign off on what these standards look like. So there will be some consideration about who we are as a community and who we will be trusting to make decisions on things. This is really, so in the end, we're going to express all this as a fair implementation profile. And there's an article on that. It's really a preprint that we've rewritten, but that may give you insight. But again, we can come back to R1.3, I think later on, once we build up our metadata and our other implementation choices. Okay, jumping back up the stack to metadata component number 4, I'm now looking at principle A 1.1. The protocol is open, free, and universally implementable. So if I look at my notes here, we have at the hospitals or somewhere, the electronic case report forms of real patients, real human beings, that's privacy protected under some jurisdiction, some set of governance and regulations. That's probably, there are national considerations there. There may be local considerations. There may be hospital policies, for example. What do those policies say about who can see those data under what conditions. We will have to clarify that for ourselves so that we can actually embed this information into the FAIR data point. So that if someone should query the FAIR data point and they should see that there are case report forms, that they will figure out, the machine will figure out exactly what needs to happen in order for those case report forms to be accessed. The access protocol could be highly restrictive, could be incredibly secure. Maybe it's multi-factor authentication, all kinds of barriers can be put up to protect the data. But there will certainly be, under some conditions under which that data can be accessed. And those policies exist somewhere. And we will need to consolidate some of that thinking so that we can embed it into the FAIR data point. We will likely be, even if we grant some kind of machine actionable access to the case report forms, we will need to also consider then the authentication authorization technologies that somehow coupled to this metadata content. So the machine will know, based on these policies and based on the algorithms coming to visit, what the appropriate access rights are. And again, I'm gonna list, there's the country, the IT organization, clinical organization, all these stakeholders may have their own policies in place for this. I will refer to 2 papers from the special issue that cover some aspects of this A principle. And maybe just to finalize this, because this may seem a little bit complicated, but I think in general, what will happen in the African VODAN FAIR data points is that we will ensure that the metadata exposed at the FAIR data point is so empty of identifiable information for the patients that metadata could be completely open and free. And we can have some kind of restriction, policy restriction on who can access the actual CRFs. But it's probably wise, just as an initial start, to really allow for the metadata on the CRFs to be completely open and available for analysis. So that would be a consideration for us. What data do we want to put into our, or let's say, what information do we want to put into our metadata, and which information do we not, if we want it to be open and free. Okay, so that was number 4. Working now to number 5. This is actually a pretty simple FAIR principle. It's designed for ensuring really good data stewardship. It's something that rarely happens, but is incredibly important. But the principle is asking us that metadata be accessible even when the data are no longer available. And the reason we want this is it's a kind of a provenance metadata question. Again, it's that time and money is being spent to generate a data set. Time and money will be required to maintain that data set. And there could very well be a time when that data is no longer supported. And that depends on budgets, and it depends on policy issues. But it's a fair question for all of us to ask. How long do we think we will host this data, and under what conditions? And even if the data should have to be either rendered, or either deleted, or if it just goes missing somehow, we want to ensure that the metadata that was pointing to it remain in place. So the way the FAIR metrics was trying to assess whether or not A2 was being met was by asking for a policy statement from that domain community that states how long the metadata should persist, even if the data itself goes missing. So on the one hand, this is a difficult piece of metadata because such policies almost never exist. It's something that a lot of organizations just haven't considered. On the other hand, it's a really easy metadata component to build, because we can just do it. And we can formulate for ourselves what that policy statement should look like. And we can even formulate it in a machine actionable manner, pretty straightforward. So this is, I think, a nice metadata element. To the degree that we solve this problem, we may in fact have solved it for almost everybody, everywhere to come. It's really a low-hanging fruit. If we solve this problem, I anticipate wide reuse on that. Very similar to component 5 is component 1, which is, if we look at the FAIR principle, F1, it's that the data elements, metadata elements, are assigned globally unique and persistent identifiers. This allows the computer to actually see the content that's there. Without unique and persistent identifiers, your digital objects are simply invisible to the computer. The computer cannot see them, cannot identify them, cannot process them. So the fact that the identifier system, that there are lots of options for us to choose. So for example, there's DOIs, there's pearls, there's many other very nice globally unique identifier systems that we can use. I think in the FAIR data point now, a choice was made for an identifier system called pearls. So you'll see that in the FAIR data point, these pearl identifiers, these persistent URLs, are being widely used. But colored in blue is this word persistence, because again, it comes to the domain community to answer for itself what is a reasonable persistence. It's not forever, because nothing is forever. So how long should the identifiers in the FAIR data point be guaranteed? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 100 years? And then how will you realistically try to meet those guarantees? So again, the way we measured this in the FAIR metric approach was by asking for a policy statement. And just as an exercise, what you might consider doing in the next week is to try and see if you can find the persistence policy for digital object identifiers or for the pearls. These are likely to be just HTML documents online at a website for the pearls or the DOIs. But see if you can locate the document that gives the policy on persistence. So for example, if the DOI service should go out of business tomorrow, it will have in its policy kind of the contingency plan, how long it will guarantee the identifiers and who will be entrusted to take them over after DOI disappears, what kind of endowments are there to back all that up, et cetera. So just having some conscious sense of how long these identifiers are likely to persist. And it's not that you're going to score higher on FAIR if you have longer guarantees of persistence. It's really what we're looking for is just having this policy document, this statement. And if you can only guarantee for a short moment of time, fine. If you can guarantee for a long time, even better. In general, because we tend to reuse identifiers that are supplied from existing services, we often will default to the policies of those services. So unless we create our own identifier systems, we probably only need to link to the policy document from the services that we use. And there's a nice article about unique and persistent resolvable identifiers at the Data Intelligence Special Issue. Point number 6 is one of the I principles. It's colored, it's I2, it's colored blue. And it says that, that the data and metadata are going to use vocabularies and ontologies that also follow the FAIR principles. So there's a couple things here. Again, as a domain community, as VODAN, we have the right or the capability to choose the vocabulary systems that we will use to mark up our data. The controlled vocabularies, the ontologies that we will use to build our RDF statements. So that's our choice. And so this line is colored blue. But then what this is asking for is that the vocabularies are also fair, that other people can find them, reuse them, that they're interoperable. So one way of phrasing this then is how fair are the vocabularies that we're actually using? Metadata that are linking to these systems can report that level of fairness in different ways. There is a fair maturity evaluation service, for example. This is an online service that can evaluate the level of fairness of a resource, like an ontology or a vocabulary, and gives you back a number. And one suggestion here is that we use that evaluation service to actually evaluate the fairness of our ontologies and our vocabularies. And then we report that as metadata. If that's a little complicated, that's okay. We can come back to it later. This could be one of the more straightforward things we can do. Although, I'm showing it kind of low on the list here because it's not necessary at the moment just to ensure the fairness of our own resource. But that's, if you take a look at the link here at the service, I think you can see better what we're trying to get at. And then lastly, I'm looking at F4. It's just asking that your data and metadata are registered and indexed in a searchable resource. So basically, we just want to guarantee that our FAIR data point will be indexed. There's not much we can do here if we rely on Google or Bing. There is some things we can do for search engine optimization, but these search engines are not particularly specialized for semantic technologies or semantic web resources. However, there are other third-party platforms out there like Data Biology, for example, that can very efficiently index things like a FAIR data point for us. What I expect is that when we set up the FAIR data points, that there's these third parties that will come in and probably just automatically begin indexing, just because this is, on one hand, such an interesting project, on the other hand, such a relevant, important project given a global pandemic. But I suspect it'll be that the very rich metadata we create on the FAIR data point could be indexed by some pretty sophisticated organizations that will allow for quite sophisticated search on our FAIR data points. So there's things we can do here for sure, but I'm showing it low on this priority list because I think there's a lot of third parties that will do most of that work for us. Okay, so that was a lot of information. The bad news is that metadata is pretty complicated, and in fact, it's never really done. You can always extend your metadata, you can always refine it, you can always make it better than it is now. So on the one hand, this could seem like a pretty overwhelming task that we have to do. There's good news, however, and like I said, FAIR is not binary. It's a real scale. It goes from from low fairness up to high fairness, and each community, given its own set of resources and skills and where it's located at the moment, has complete control over how deep it wants to go into creating metadata. And we should feel no obligation to complete all of these, to check the list on all 9 priorities. It's enough for us just to have a clear understanding of the big picture, and then to formulate a nice roadmap and a plan For the things we don't get to in this project, we can always build, for example, placeholders and say, you know, this metadata is under consideration. And we can prioritize the things that we want to do first, that are most important, and leave the other things for later. So I don't want anybody to feel overwhelmed in like this is an impossible task. It's really something entirely under our own discretion, and we can adjust the goals in the metadata for machine workshop to match, you know, the fact that we've got 8 sessions in this metadata for machine workshop, and we have 6 months in the entire project. So what can we do in that time frame? And that's a perfectly reasonable and logical way to proceed here. So just a few minutes left. I don't want to go over time. This is your homework assignment. And this is, if you go to the link here, this metadata for machine scoping exercise, what you will see is a Google spreadsheet that is basically what I just went through. Each of the 9 metadata components are listed in each row. The FAIR principle is corresponding to that is listed. There's some general discussion about what's being asked for in each case. And then for each of what could be 8 FAIR data points in the VODAN Africa project, I'm going to ask for you to begin sketching what you think should go in each of these boxes. And it's perfectly okay for it to be completely human readable text. It can be bullet points. It could be links to things. It could be questions, but just begin to formulate your own understanding of what's here. Now I'm showing this, you know, per FAIR data point. So I would try to ask for those of you who are, for example, involved in the Ugandan KIU FAIR data point, that you answer collectively in that column. And then likewise for Ethiopia 1 and 2, and Zimbabwe, Nigeria. So for your FAIR data point, go ahead and with the stakeholders that you're most involved with, see if you can answer in your own narrative text the priority and the ideas that you would have for your metadata there. This is just to get us thinking more deeply about the metadata requirements in relation to FAIR. And what we will do, if you can complete this by next week, we can begin then to do an assessment on what people are answering, and see if we can find overlaps, corresponding ideas that we can then start linking up. What we want to do is eventually come to a kind of a consensus on what the VODAN metadata is going to look like, and then a kind of priority list for how we approach it in the workshop. So I've got just 1 minute to go. What I will do is, you know, there was a couple questions that came to me via the registration for the Zoom, and this one was question 1, and this is question 2. So just super brief. For question 1, there was an interest in, you know, how long is it going to take to do this? And partly my answer is to consider this local verification process that will happen in the hospitals. How do you get data from the patient into the CRF? And, you know, I think that's going to be the harder solution, or the harder problem to solve, while we work in parallel on the metadata. But I'm happy to go into this in more detail if you would like. The second question, if data is stored locally, then how do we link to it? And there's a couple elements to that. Well, you consider the policy, who can link to it, and under what conditions. There's an actual technical protocol. Is it HTTP, or is it an FTP, or is it some other kind of protocol? There's authorization, authentication. And consider the identifiers that you're using. You will need a unique and persistent identifier to make that link. The FAIR data point is giving us that already, but that's one of the questions involved here. What are the possible scenarios to make the patient-related data stored in these online repositories. I'm showing you a snapshot here, a screenshot from the exact same question now being worked out at the Leiden University Medical Center in here in Leiden in the Netherlands. And without answering this in detail, let me say that this is exactly what we will be doing both in the Netherlands and in Africa over the next couple months. How do we choose which online repositories are appropriate for our data? Again, I'll just reference a nice link here, but that's a question we come back to later if you like. So that's it for me. Until next week, your homework assignment is to see how much progress you can make on scoping out these metadata elements. If there's any questions or struggle here, let me know, and we will try to help you make some progress. But the idea here is that this is the first step in helping us decide how we want to approach these 9 metadata components for FAIR. Okay, so that's it from me. Hey, I don't know if you would like to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Erik. Actually, before we close, we had a few questions in the chat as well, and I just want to, give people another 10 minutes maybe to hear some responses from you before we close. Sure. But there was one question here that, let me just go there right in the beginning, and that was really about the principle A2.
Yep.
And saying, what is the advantage of having that if the data is already gone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so think of it as really like our metadata is on a FAIR data point, and I think of the FAIR data point as a publication platform. Your metadata are really like mini publications, and in that sense, they should have some kind of longevity behind them. But imagine if, for whatever reason, there was a bunch of case report forms that were accidentally deleted or somehow went missing at the local hospital. It would still be incredibly valuable to know that they had existed, either just to keep track of infection rates or in retrospective analyses. There's value to the metadata, primarily because it costs time and money and energy to create data in itself. And so it's just nice to have that permanent record of it. It's sort of a step on the way towards what we think of traditionally as a publication. Let me say too, the other way of looking at this is if the data do go missing, your metadata could be updated to actually say so. And so then the user that's visiting will know that this data, they should stop looking for it because it no longer exists. And people often talk about this as a kind of tombstone metadata element. So it's really like saying, hey, this data no longer exists and it was terminated for these reasons. And then it just gives clarity as well on findability issues.
Thank you, Erik. I can see I have a few more questions, so I doubt we're going to get to all of them. Some are more practical and some are more, content-wise. But I can see here Susan, for instance, she was asking that, since the FAIR data will be installed in different points, how will that data then actually be merged into an isolated data center so that in case the data is lost, there's kind of one place where you can retrieve it? And she followed that question up actually by saying, especially with the large volume of data or information that organizations may wish to host, for scalability purposes, can that data be hosted here, on a cloud? So the example is AWS, for example.
Yeah, great questions. And what I like about this question is that the answers lie entirely within you, the stakeholders. Those are precisely the kinds of questions that data stewards are supposed to answer. And of course, GoFair is here to advise where we can. But it's really, with the beauty about having data so distributed like this is that it's really up to that data owner, that stakeholder, the policies under which that data is being created. Those will dictate, where these data can be stored, how they should be backed up, whether or not they are allowed to go onto commercial platforms, if they can actually be located geographically elsewhere, like in the cloud maybe, and some kind of. I know already it's quite possible when you work in cloud environments that you can set geographic restrictions on where the data is going to be actually physically located. So those are great decisions to be discussed and rationalized in a metadata for machine workshop.
Thanks, Erik. So a lot of, more reflection and decision that needs to be done on the various stakeholder side, to decide, like you're saying, how to host, where to host it. And I have here, I'll take one more of the more technical questions, which is really about security issues. And I can imagine that's on lots of people's minds, right? And so here the question is, if the data is left open and available, what about security issues? And I know you had mentioned already that, the A in accessible doesn't necessarily mean open, right? It can mean open, but it's not always open. But the question is here, if it's open and available, what about security issues?
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to, so again, I will state that one simple option we have to go forward, and this one that I would recommend, is that the FAIR data point itself and the metadata located on it is of such a nature that it can be freely and openly exposed. And that might mean that what is being exposed is actually quite limited in terms of data content, and that's okay. We can still indicate, for example, that there are so many case report forms in existence, and to actually get to those case report forms would then require the fulfillment of some kind of authorization and authentication and compliance to the policies and governance in that location. So that needs to be very clearly and explicitly stated, number one, before the machine or even humans know what they have access to. And yeah, just to reiterate, the FAIR principles were conceived also very much for closed data. There's a lot of proprietary data, for example, in companies, right? A company pays for the creation of some data. It's their discretion whether or not they want to make it open or not. In any case, it could still be made fair. Mm-hmm. And it still has a great advantage in being fair, even if it's not open. On the other hand, there's lots of examples of open data that are not fair. That a lot of open access journals, for example, the machine will kind of run into brick walls if it's trying to access information on those articles or in the metadata about those articles, because some of these things that we're talking about with the FAIR data point are not there. So open and closed is something that's accommodated well by the FAIR principles, and that was by design. I came back to this page here because in the journal article here, the A for FAIR, there's a very nice notion of data being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And certainly patient data will never be open, cannot be open. So it must be closed and protected, but it can still be fair.
Thanks, Erik. And the final one, which is on a more operational side, so is a question that came in, which is saying, the exercise which you've shared, the Excel exercise, is it at individual level or is it the entire country representative team? So I think that's your slide. Is it 28?
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a good question. And I would say that if you want to answer this at an individual level, then I think it's a good idea to maybe copy the table into another environment or just work out the answers for yourself in your own document somehow. But I think what we would like to see is that for all the stakeholders involved in each of these fair data points, that eventually there will be a kind of collective discussion and a collective decision-making so that, the Ugandan fair data point at Kampala International University would like to have this set of metadata set in that fair data point. And Ethiopia 1 and 2 will have its own decision-making. Zimbabwe will have its own decision-making. So I think that would be the ideal place we can get to. At the same time, there's absolutely no reason why there cannot be collaboration. And in fact, there's every good reason to have collaboration because, we would love to find convergence and interoperability. There's just no reason at the level of the fair data point to have diverging policies in place or metadata elements. So I would love to see that, in fact, what we end up with in the end is a highly uniform commitment to fair metadata options in each of these categories. And this is the first step in just helping the stakeholders to come to terms with what's needed. But then in the next few workshops, we'll try to guide a process of convergence on that. So definitely, I think that the watchword here is really to be highly communicative if you can, to the degree that you are familiar with each other on a personal level. Keep those channels open, because if somebody's solving a problem for component number 2 and gets to a reasonable solution, that can be shared amongst all of you. And that would be a highly efficient way of going about this. So, we have a large number of stakeholders here, but what we want in the end is convergence onto a reusable set of metadata schema that each of you can use to run your fair data points.
Right. Okay, and now for those of you in the webinar who are wondering about more kind of tactical operational things, which is where will I be able to see the presentation, the resources, etc. Let me just walk you through briefly. So all of the resources, this presentation from Erik, as well as the recorded webinar, and also the Excel sheet, you will receive them via the various communication platforms. So that is either your WhatsApp group, your Slack, and also via email. As well, just a reminder, I know the pre-registration is a new process which we have started now, but we are starting it specifically so that we can gather some of your questions in advance and ensure that Erik and his team have those questions so they can build them in to their presentation. So for the workshop next week on comparison and consensus, you will receive an email from Ivy again with the pre-registration, so you can drop your questions in there. But also if you have questions for the exercise now that maybe you're struggling with, or things that reflections that came out for you after this workshop. So that's why we have the pre-link, but you will receive all of the resources in the WhatsApp, in the Slack, or via your email as well. You will need to give us a bit of time. The recorded version is not available instantaneously. Normally it takes about 24 hours for us to compress it so it is not too big. So for that. Now, thank you, Erik. Of course, metadata for humans today it's a good introduction, and we look forward to the 12th, the workshop on the 12th, where we talk a little bit more about convergence. But I do also want to just acknowledge, I hope he's still here, Dr. Mpeza, the chair, of course, of VODAN Africa and Vice Chancellor of Kampala International University. So Dr. Mpeza, if you're here, thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know if you would like to say a couple of remarks, or if you're just happy to be quiet in the background. Let me just give you an opportunity in case.
Faye, this is Miriam. Hi, I think that the VC was here, but then he had to go to another engagement. However, he was in touch with me, and he said that it was an excellent instructor. So there you go, Erik.
Okay.
He thought it was a very good explanatory talk, and he very much enjoyed the whole flow phase. So also thank you for hosting this. So from what I gathered, he enjoyed it a lot, and he was very proud for the many people who were there and sent his regards.
Thank you very much for that update. I'm glad he was able to participate at least a little bit. So in this case, now I know we're already a few minutes overboard, so I don't want to keep you any longer, but we really appreciate all of you joining and staying with us today. 33 participants in total. So look out in your mailboxes and on Slack and in the WhatsApp for this recording, but also for the advanced information for next week, where we'll be talking about convergence. And again, I hope we'll get a lot of advanced questions from you so that we can build that in. But in the meantime, we wish you a good rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again virtually next week, Tuesday at the latest. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Faye.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Erik. Yes.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.